will not tag Saquon Barkley ahead of the deadline later this afternoon. What does it mean for the New York Football Giants entering free agency? What does it mean for Saquon Barkley? And do we expect the same to happen when it comes to one Xavier McKinney? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant podcast, where I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the breaking news as it's been reported that Saquon Barkley will not receive a second franchise tag from the New York Football Giants. Maybe not altogether surprising, although we did hear some whispers, especially even more than whispers from Joe Schoen, that it could have been a viable option for the Giants as they approach the deadline today and the new league year, which will start on March 13th. Before we dive in on it all, we let you know that today's live update on YouTube is brought to you by Personam. Personam is an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine that improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms just can't do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Go check out Personam today for, frankly, your network security needs. All right, as we talk about this here, no tag for Saquon Barkley. He's going to be able to test the market. Now, the things that kind of I think factored into this, where was the tag a potential option for Joe Schoen and the Giants? It's interesting because when the cap went up by 20 million total, and by all reports 10 million more than expected by organizations around the league, you think, well, you can certainly afford now to look at Saquon Barkley differently, and that can be looked at a total contract. We want to offer him a 3-year deal. Suddenly those numbers look different. But as Andy and I discussed at the time, just because the cap goes up, well, guess what? So does the contract desires or expectations from free agents around the league or in-house guys like Saquon Barkley. Now, the unique factor that Saquon sits inside of the running back room, a market whose value continues to depreciate, which we'll get into here as we talk about this going forward, makes it a little bit even trickier, I think, because now that tag number, as we'll highlight a couple of people who discussed this over on Twitter, Dan Duggan, obviously covering the team, when he talked about it, that mentioned here, Saquon Barkley is back in the tag dance and joined by Xavier McKinney. Not expecting either to get tagged. This is obviously ahead of what the report is that he will not be. But the $12.1 million now, which at one point you would say, well, if you're the Giants, you have to at least be willing to consider that as opposed to letting him walk into free agency. And then when the cap increases, you go, and now you can definitely do it because 12.1 is even less punitive against your cap and against the offseason and what you want to accomplish. The hard part is that the market for running backs seems to be getting diminished even further here, especially when we think about the number of guys that are going to be inside of this pool. I'll try to keep an eye on whether or not any news has come out about Josh Jacobs and their intention. There was some speculation that they seemed closer to wanting to bring him back than maybe let him hit the market, but they're in the same waters as the Giants are. Valuable player, certainly is better than any option we're going to have this offseason and maybe even in the draft. Yes, there's players that could show up, but you have a proven commodity right now in-house. Yet, there's a world where some are saying that he may not even Saquon Barkley see anything in double figures, meaning somewhere between $9+ million on the open market. So the interesting thing for me from a Giants perspective now is, on the one hand, you've kind of towed this line perfectly, right? We value Saquon Barkley. He's a vocal leader in the locker room. He does everything you want on the field. He is a captain this past season. And we have to understand the restraints of the market and what it looks like to pay running backs at that, pay a premium position like that when you have all these other needs, which is a reality for the Giants too, unlike other teams. So you say all the right things publicly. You like Saquon, you believe in him, and you also understand why he wants to get paid. Then you do the good faith thing, which is we're not going to tag you, right? Hey, you want to go to the market. You believe that these negotiations that we had have not gotten where you wanted them to, which is a long-term deal. Go ahead, go to the market and allow them to tell you where your value is. So now you're letting him, you're setting him free to go hit free agency and say, if that offer is out there for you, we will of course miss what you provide for us from a production standpoint at the position. And at the same time, that was too rich for our blood. And we're very happy that you were able to go get that. Now, the other side of it is he goes to market Nobody really comes to the table. And this is where I think it is marginally tricky. Because if you're Saquon Barkley and you go to market and the deals don't materialize, in theory, Joe Schoen could say, hey, come on back in, right? Like we always said we liked you. We always said we wanted you here. We always said that we valued you. It does come down to the business and the dollars and cents of it. But we're still going to give you a good contract. You went to the market and the best offer you received was 9.2 million. We're going to give you 9.5. The Giants will look absolutely brilliant in this because they'll come out being able to pay him less in the short term, 12.1 million versus sub 10. And then in the big picture, if you end up getting him, let's say you brought him back in on a 3-year deal, the guaranteed money comes down. Maybe you even do the good faith gesture and give him something still close to $20 million in guaranteed money over the life of the contract and make it effectively a 2-year deal. That could be the case. My only interesting talking point here is whether or not Saquon, even if he goes to market and doesn't see the dollars materialize the way he anticipates, that he'll still come back and say, like, I still want that deal though. Like, can you fracture that relationship where Saquon, if it's marginal, is going to say, I went to the market and got offered 9.5. You're offering me 9.8. At that point, I still feel like my home franchise, the franchise that drafted me, is giving me some level of disrespect here. I'm going to go with another deal. I'm going to go with an opportunity where I have a chance to win, maybe. When we talk about who are the teams that could be coming here to the table with him. And the other part about this is, and we'll see how it plays itself out. The other side of this is going to free agency, and we say, well, it looks like the market's low and no team's going to overspend. Again, we talked about this with, let's use the Houston Texans as the example. When you have as much cap space as they do, the dollars are not created equal. The New York Football Giants, like if we think about them purely at this point, from where everyone stands right now, no restructuring of contracts or anything like that. When we go over and look at the Giants relative to other teams in the league, well, you're going to have total cap space right now. Arizona Cardinals are through the roof. The Commanders are through the roof. The Patriots are through the roof. And when you get to the Houston Texans, ironically, they're 7th right now at just north of $70 million. So there's other teams you could talk about. Like I mentioned before, the Washington Commanders, they probably feel comfortable with who they have, but they have the money to burn. The Arizona Cardinals, they have limitless money to burn. But when we talk about the Houston Texans, $70 million, the New York Football Giants are all the way down. And we say all the way down because it's just the reality of where they sit. Take a look at, as I lose track of where there they are, $41 million right now, right? So the Giants want to sign Saquon Barkley to 12 million, and that's just what it's going to cost against the cap this year. Let's just use that. Let's use 10 million. Well, now they have $31 million to spend. The Xavier McKinney piece, which we'll get to here, they have to figure out what they're going to do with him, even if it's the transition tag. If he ends up playing on that number, around $13 million. So right there, 23 out of your $41 million is gone, and you're going to leave yourself with $17-ish million to go out and address the offensive line if you want to. Edge rusher, linebacker, wide receiver at a lower tier. We don't think they're going to go high level in free agency for a wide receiver, but all those things are factored in. The Houston Texans, we'll give you $10 million. We'll give you $12 million. We'll give you $15 million. We still have $55 million to operate with. And as we know, when you go to the draft, you need to think about, I think the 6th overall pick comes with a little north of $6 million price point potentially there, depending on what type of position you're taking. But if that's going to be the case, the Giants have to factor that in too. And then injury allocation. You always have that in the coffers in case in season. So you're going to have somewhere around $10 million is usually the going rate. So the Giants, after retaining Saquon Barkley on a contract, tagging or retaining Xavier McKinney on a contract, and then having money for the draft class and injuries going into the season, they're going to be under $10 million left in space. Then they can structure these contracts, especially Xavier McKinney. You can think about moving some of that money on the back end of it so that this year it's not as damaging if you want to go make decisions in free agency that you want to have some extra capital for. So you can always manipulate the dollars. But just, again, on balance, the Houston Texans have $30 million more to operate with. And that's where I think people might be underestimating the willingness of a team like Houston or any team that's going to be interested in Saquon. And I think differently than a Josh Jacobs, because again, when you go and look at the numbers, you can say these guys are comparable, but we understand that Saquon Barkley is that dynamic playmaker, is that generational kind of talent that if you are a team that has deep playoff run aspirations, he can be that home run hitter in one single play. Playing for the Giants, we've seen this. behind an atrocious offensive line, right? -1, -5, -2, 0, 1, 2, 3 yards, only having 20 yards over the course of an entire game. And then in one play, breaks off a 65-yard run, all of a sudden puts you in scoring position, all of a sudden takes his stat line and makes it look more reflective of what his talent is, even if the production isn't there over the course of an entire game. So I do think that he's going to be regarded as one of the top, if not the top running backs available on the market. And so does a team have a willingness or an appetite to pay him more than maybe what market value is? We say, hey, to Tim, who says, will the Giants sign Barkley to a 4-year extension prior to free agency? No, they're not going to do that, Tim. They just let him walk into free agency without tagging him, and they're going to see what the market dictates. 4 years is a very long time. I think the 3-year deal is a more viable option. I wonder if teams in free agency will offer him a substantial payday on a 2-year deal. So again, Houston Texans say, "Hey, we'll give you 25 million. We'll give you 30 million with almost fully guaranteed money, knowing that in 2 years it's done, you're off, right? Like you can commit hard to that because you have your rookie contract for your QB, because you're in a little bit of a win now mode. And that makes it a more palatable decision. I'd be curious about how many teams maybe get interested in this as well. Like if we think about, I mentioned like you have Connor in Arizona, so it's not like you're desperate for a running back, and he's had very successful seasons. He had some injuries, but has come back healthy. Is that a different dynamic of running back? What's the style of play that you're looking there for? Why not the New England Patriots? Now, they've never been a team historically that has had an appetite for bringing in high-priced free agent running backs or spending a lot on that position, but this is a new era, right? It's a new coaching staff there. It's a new version of this team, and if they're thinking about going rookie quarterback, and you could say it's the same thing about the New York Giants, why not put a dynamic playmaking running back in the backfield for him? $91.495 million in cap space for the Patriots. They're a team that can absorb a 3-year contract, for Saquon Barkley and not really worry about what it's going to look like 2 and 3 years down the line. If they're sitting there at 3 and they're thinking Jaden Daniels, or now there's some talk, where is JJ McCarthy in the hierarchy of this? Are they even going to trade back? All these different options they have. But if they stay put and they take a QB there, and they're going to turn over the page and move on from Mac Jones, obviously, they can afford to spend that extra money in free agency on a Saquon Barkley. Maybe they like a Josh Jacobs. Maybe they like a Swift at a lower price point. Whatever the number is, though, I could see New England at least being in the conversation for it. Chicago Bears, likewise, right? They're going to be going, we assume, with Caleb Williams at the top of this draft class. Okay. They're sitting there right now with $76.5 million in cap space. They have running backs. They have talent in the room. But again, if they want to, any of these teams, if you want to bring in a more dynamic playmaker in the backfield with your young quarterback, Saquon Barkley represents that. Let's bring it back in-house for a second here, because there's other teams. I'm going down the list here. Detroit Lions aren't going to be in that mix. Cincinnati Bengals are letting go of Joe Mixon, but it would seem maybe counterintuitive. I think Joe Mixon is another fantastic running back, and you have to think about where's his market going to be and what they look to do. But they have money, $52 million, if they want to go that route. But they have other big needs, I think, on their roster they want to address. Tampa Bay might be mildly interesting too. Like they chose to bring back and go with Mike Evans. They have to sort out, obviously, Baker Mayfield, if he's going to return. Not as much money. They're only at $44 million, so they're in the same kind of waters as the Giants. But teams like that, as you work your way down the list. Let's bring it back in-house to the New York Football Giants, as we let you know that not only reported by Adam Schefter, we also had this from Dan Duggan, and Adam Schefter reported this, but give credit as well to Ryan Dunleavy. Free agent running back class will now be headlined by Saquon Barkley and include Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler, Tony Pollard, and DeAndre Swift, among others. Best class of running backs in free agent history. So there's that side of it. And then there's also going to be the draft that factors into this. But bring it back internally, right? I think the other side of this too, from a Giants narrative, as we say here, I wouldn't bet your house on that, Tim. Yes, I would tend to agree in terms of the extension for Saquon Barkley. Coming back to the Giants. If you are the Giants, here's the other part of it. Okay, and now we've heard the speculation. By the way, just some in-house here. We recorded this morning. We wanted to talk about the QBs. We wanted to talk about where things stand in the draft there, the rumors coming out of the combine from Rich Eisen that the Giants have buyer's remorse and are ready to move on from Daniel Jones, whether it's immediately. or next season, like whenever that time comes. And we even did a little Russell Wilson talk because Andy has some thoughts on that too. So we covered all that, but now we're going to hold that episode until later tonight and do this live now, talking about the most pertinent information that Saquon Barkley will not be franchise tagged by the New York Football Giants. Internally, if you know that the time is up on Daniel Jones. So two things come into play here. If you're going to draft a rookie quarterback and you think it's likely that he's going to play this season, then you can look at Saquon Barkley and say, it wouldn't hurt us. It wouldn't hurt us to have him back in the room, even if it costs us a little bit more to make sure we have that security blanket. Even though Saquon Barkley benefits any quarterback, I think it's different if you're talking about Jaden Daniels, talking about JJ McCarthy coming in 3, 4, 5 games into the season and taking over the starting QB role. You want to have that safety valve, right? You want to have that benefit of reliability, of consistency with him in the backfield to go along with whatever other moves you make. The other side of it would be if you're going wide receiver, if you're going to go Neighbors, if he's there, if you're going to go Odunze, right? If you're going in that direction and you're staying away from QB for this particular class, or maybe you're going to get one in the second round or moving to the back end of the first round, but the expectations are we can let this kid sit. There's no pressure to get him in. I think top 5, top 10 quarterbacks, you want to see them get on the field sooner than later. We talked about this in tonight's episode. JJ McCarthy, 21 years old, 24 years old, Jaden Daniels, right? So you are talking about a different timeline there around these guys too. So if you take a guy in second round or move into the late first and there's no expectations he's going to get in, then I don't think you need to keep Saquon because it's really about next year. And then you can go into the draft and you can add a running back and you can develop them over the course of this season in the middle round and give them a year to get their feet underneath them. So there's that side of it here too. Lastly, if we talk about going to the draft and Joe Alt falls to 6 and you say, I'm not messing around. Evan Neal, thanks so much. Get out of here. Or you can move Fuaga is going to be there. We have guys in the second round that we talk about. If there's an offensive lineman, if you think that maybe you're going to spend 2 out of your first 3 picks in this draft addressing that area, I don't think that's highly likely. I think at least 1, but I think free agency is going to play a big factor there after the Giants obviously let go of Glowinski, ate a little bit of dead cap to free up $5.7 million. If you're going to go that route, then you can look at it from 2 ways. Hey, Daniel Jones, we're going to see what happens with him. We're helping to fix the offensive line, and Saquon's going to give us the best value there. Or a lower cost free agent is going to benefit from having a better line. So all these things work in conjunction. And I think I won't say it by name because I'm not trying to be dismissive towards someone over on Twitter. I'm not trying to put them down. But a commentary was framed in the idea of being pro or anti Saquon, being pro or anti Xavier McKinney, being pro or anti Daniel Jones. Why not just be pro New York Giants and wanting them to do well? And the reason why you can't do that is because everything is interconnected. The dollars are all interconnected. The future of this franchise is interconnected with these decisions. And everybody who's a fan of the Giants, whether you're covering them, whether you're just watching the games on Sunday, of course you want the team to be good. But they have not displayed from the top down a track record over the last decade that tells you we should just, have blind faith and be ready to root for the team they put on the field. We are going to, but letting Saquon Barkley go to free agency is maybe going to save you money. Letting giving Xavier McKinney the tag, which we'll discuss here, is going to keep you below, and then we're going to talk about tag versus transition tag and those price points, can maybe buy you a year, can buy you time to negotiate as well. And that's the last footnote here about Saquon Barkley, who the Giants will not be franchise tagging for the second consecutive season. He will be able to go to the market. Couple of notes. 1, the official league year starts on the 13th. So there is still some negotiating window here. Maybe there's buying themselves a little bit more time to discuss with him, or ultimately he'll go to market and see where things stand. And we'll have to continue to monitor it. One thing that Andy consistently brings up is about the market, about New York, about the post-playing career. I push back on that a little bit, that if another team wants to give you $3 more million per season and it's over a 3-year contract, an extra $10 million now ends up becoming more substantial than some of the things you're going to go after you finish playing football. But if you want it to be a factor, certainly. If you want it to be a factor that Saquon would prefer to play for a single franchise, as he's publicly said, then yes, of course it matters. So I'll be very curious if it's a dollar for dollar match. Then we turn our attention over here to Xavier McKinney, and then we'll discuss some free agency, some draft options here in terms of replacing Saquon Barkley potentially. When we talk about Xavier McKinney, the speculation is that they may go with the free agency tag, the transition tag, excuse me. So rather than going with the franchise tag, which is going to come in around $17 million for Xavier McKinney, and feels like a large number on a short-term 1-year option. And as we say too, people talked about, well, Saquon Barkley, why wouldn't you just tag him at 12.1? Because the money counts now, right? Because the money counts now and it comes off your cap right now, as does the 17 million if you were to tag Xavier McKinney. The other way to go is the transition tag, which comes down closer to 13. You allow him to be able to negotiate with other teams, but surrendering 2 first-round picks if you want to sign him away from the Giants feels like that's going to be a pretty big deterrent for other teams out there on the market. So you buy yourself that time. Just like with Saquon Barkley, it just can extend the negotiating table and how you want to work. I'd be curious if Xavier McKinney, who, remember, at the time of the draft, he ends up being there at the top of the second round. The Giants feel like they get a real value steal there for a player that was graded universally across boards as a cemented first round talent. So he didn't get first round dollars, though. So like, this is, unlike Saquon, when you're taking second overall, he's made some substantial money in his career already. So for Xavier McKinney, this is about the payday. So I think that he's going to want that now. He can't stop them from transition tagging him. And the narrative that was there with Wink Martindale and what was going on, that seems to have shifted back around, obviously, with his departure and the way some people talk about it. And then even Xavier McKinney, he's been out on social media saying, don't follow these threads about, and he wasn't directly addressing them, but don't follow these threads about what's been said and what's gone on. Like, just trust the actions. And this is a guy that played every single snap this past season, right there, along with Bobby Okereke, up the middle, having that consistency. Dexter Lawrence, Bobby Okereke, Xavier McKinney, like, that matters. And while we're a fan of Pinnock, we're a fan of Belton, right? Those guys, I mean, Pinnock's had a very good run, obviously, with the Giants, but his contract will come up soon enough too. And then what's that going to look like? And Dame Belton hasn't taken that next big step forward to this point of his career. So this is value. Xavier McKinney matters here. So maybe they find a way to get into, as Dan Duggan had reported, something in an annual contract in an AAV value between 12 and 14 million. I think those are perfectly manageable numbers. I'm perfectly happy to sign up with those. I don't want to get into the 15 and $16 million a year range. I think you just always end up looking back at those contracts as being pretty handcuffing down the line when you want to make other moves. But if you can get him underneath 14 million on a multi-year deal, 4-year deal, I think you would sign up for that. And then again, you can massage those numbers to allow a big cap hit to come next offseason, as opposed to this one, keep some flexibility in other players you want to pursue. That's why it behooves them, I think, to go in that direction with Xavier McKinney if they want to retain him. The transition tag, you can do it. It's a stopgap, but I think you'll have enough flexibility here to get it done and get a long-term deal taken care of for him. So cycling back here to the top, if you're in on the conversation over on YouTube Live, feel free to jump in with it, your questions, your comments. We'll continue to rattle through this a little bit here and look at free agency and the draft for the Giants if Saquon Barkley were to walk. No tag expected to be coming for Saquon Barkley for the second consecutive season. Would have been $12.1 million. The market has come down across the board for running backs. The numbers are being suggested at sub 10 million for Saquon Barkley, for other players like Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, out there in free agency at the position. And ironically, a year ago, when you maybe had 22, I think, there's so many speculated numbers. There was, we believe, a 3-year, or maybe it was a 2-year deal, but 22 million guaranteed. Like, the money was set there for Saquon Barkley to understandably feel like he was worth more and wait. Now finds himself in a free agent pool with a lot of other running backs. Like, that, unfortunately, has just been what's come here, right? Now, all of a sudden, everybody, a handful of biggest names, like Schefter said, the biggest, or the most talented, free agency class in history at the running back position. I don't think that that's hyperbole. Like, it is substantial what these players have been able to do um, over the course of their careers, and now what they could bring to another team. If you are the New York Football Giants, do you look at any of these other players, these other familiar names? So I don't think if you're not willing to spend 12 million a year on Saquon Barkley, why would you be willing to spend 10.5 million on Josh Jacobs, right? Like, it just something about that wouldn't make sense to me. An interesting one is Derrick Henry. Now, he's going to be actually just 30 years old. He'll be 31 well into the season upcoming. He now, his market though is listed at 10.3. This number has been lower over on Spot Track now. It's up to 10.3 million on a 1-year deal. That actually is interesting to me too. I think it's highly unlikely that Derrick Henry maybe would come to the Giants. Talk about teams ready to win now. Maybe that number even gets a little bit higher on a 1-year deal. Go to some place that's looking to have that deep playoff run and is willing to overspend on a short-term contract that doesn't hurt them in the big picture. Josh Jacobs is listed at 10.6 million per Spot Track. His market value goes with a 4-year, $42 million average 10.6 AAV, listed as a running back 7 right now, according to Spot Track. Then we get to Saquon Barkley. Now, all these things, they move in motion. 9.9 million. So he's just below the double digit. We can just round it up and say it's a 10 million. But they look at him as a 3-year, 29.9 million. So there is a difference there, right? Like Josh Jacobs, they're giving that extra year to, whereas Saquon, they're taking one away. Why? Saquon's 27 years old. Josh Jacobs is 26. Derrick Henry is 30. I mean, it literally goes in order, right? If you're 30 years old, you're on a 1-year deal. If you're 27 years old, you can get 3 years. If you're Josh Jacobs, 26, you can get that 4th year potentially inside of one of these contracts. Although even the 4 years, even for Josh Jacobs, like, do you want to be there in that year 30 for him? Or do you want to be out of it at year 29, having gone to the draft, having another free agency class come up? So I have a hard time even thinking that a 4th year is coming for any of these running backs, let alone Josh Jacobs. Tony Pollard, who had an underwhelming, taking that next big step, this is probably the first opportunity. And I'm not saying this is the guy the Giants should pursue if they wanted to replace Saquon in free agency to some level. 6.5 million, a 2-year, $13 million deal. He's bumping up against 27 years old entering this season. That's interesting to me. Is that the gap here, right? 10 million to 6.5. That is a substantial savings. 3.5 million. Is it enough? Probably not. And I don't think for a player like Tony Pollard, I would say that it makes sense. We had mentioned previously someone like Gus Edwards. Listen, his market value is a 1-year because of injury history, $3.6 million. Probably hard to invest the dollars with a little bit of a lack of security around whether or not he could get hurt. Like 3.6 million feels great until he gets injured and he's not playing. And that's a risk you have to take across the board. But he is an interesting player to me. Andy had previously mentioned a guy like Devin Singletary. He, again, will be 27 years old in this upcoming season. He's on board for 3 years, 16.1 million market value. So you're only talking about an average AAV of $5.4 million effectively. That one's interesting, right? Cutting your cost in half. And Singletary has certainly been a guy, obviously has some familiarity with Buffalo, has had some successful seasons. That to me is the most interesting part of this, is how do the Giants associate free agency value, market value for a running back if they're going to replace Saquon on the free agent market? Then that's interesting to me, because you do have to associate the dollars being spent. Last couple of names that I'll mention here before we talk about just where some guys kind of stand inside of the draft class and expectations of when running backs could start to come off the board. You have guys like DeAndre Swift is out there on the market. I'm very curious here. Oh, yes, no, Spot Track does. He's listed further down the list, but he has a 4-year, 27 million, 6.7 AAV. So that makes sense to me. He gets further down the list. You're wondering if they're putting these guys in more financial order. But remember, Swift, just 25 years old. So 4th year for him, more palatable to me than it is for a player like Josh Jacobs. And Josh Jacobs has been a bell cow back, right? He's been the focal point of offenses for a number of seasons. So you have to take that into consideration as well. 6.7 again for Swift versus 9.9 for Saquon. I'd probably bite the 3 million, 3.2 million and say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and keep Saquon Barkley. Last couple of names I'll just throw out here as we go through this. What is we talk about the top end of it. Yeah, they're leading a very talented top end class. This is a deep class across the board. Like when you think about some of these names, I mentioned there before Gus Edwards, but J.K. Dobbins for Baltimore is also available and on the market. And he's going to get a 2-year, 4.3 million. Injuries have played a factor for him as well. But he's a 25, going to be 26-year-old running back. 2 years at a low, that type of low cost. Like these are manageable numbers to take a chance on a guy and then still go to the draft. And that's the both and that I think the Giants can do here. We're not going to pay Saquon on the tag at $12 million. We're not going to be willing to pay him $10 million on a multi-year contract, but I can spend $3 to $4 million in free agency. And then I can go to the mid round of the draft and add another back in here. And all that extra dollars means I go, as Andy has highlighted before, I go get Robert Hunt in free agency, right? Or I commit to the top end of the draft and getting someone there. Like it's not too hard to see how the dollars convert right into solving another problem. We talked about this with the trade for Darren Waller. And even though you got that value, sent out the pick you received from the Kadarius Toney trade, but it still occupies draft capital. So you weren't able to make as many free agent moves that you would have liked, wasting money a year ago on Paris Campbell. Was it that much money? No. But the margin move of maybe a year sooner, moving off Glowinski, taking some dead cap money, combining it with that spent capital on Paris Campbell, now all of a sudden you've turned it into a stronger offensive lineman that maybe takes that need off the board a year sooner, rather than it still being an issue now here in the 2024 offseason. The last couple of names I'll mention, I mentioned Antonio Gibson, 25, going to be 26 years old. I keep coming back to him. They've got him on a 1-year prove it $3.6 million deal, maybe looking to then go back in and find success on the market a year later. Now, listen, this past season only had 2 starts, or he lost it, only played 42% of the snaps, only had 65 rushes, 265. I think he had some injuries mixed in there as well. Average 4.1. But he is a receiving back in the way that Saquon hasn't really been since his rookie year. Over the course of his career, going back to 2020, 36 for 247, 42 for 294, 46 for 353, 48 for 389 this past season. Like, he got moved into that type of role. If you believe at all in Eric Gray between the tackles, and then maybe still going, right, 4th round, 5th round, going for a running back in the draft, Antonio Gibson to me would be, again, at 3.6 million, at sub $4 million. I don't have to squint too hard to see the value of bringing that player in on a 1-year deal. And I certainly see much better value than bringing in Matt Breida, right? Who was multiple years older than you brought him in, never really had that type of history of being high level successful. It had, I think, one like half season stint where he was considered to be the focal point in Buffalo. I still keep coming back to him. I don't know why. I'm probably drinking the Kool-Aid on players getting better when they leave Washington and move on to their next destination. So that's the last one that I'll list here for the time being. We can turn our attention, obviously, over to the draft and just highlight some players there as well. Remind you, first and foremost, that Saquon Barkley, it's reported, will not be, from multiple outlets, receiving the franchise tag from the New York Football Giants. Official league year doesn't start until March 14th. Still time to change that narrative, but expectations are, as of now, he'll go to the market, be able to see what teams are willing to dance with him. And while we say right now, well, it's a very saturated market and there's a lot of players there, I do not stop short of a team like the Houston Texans. And I'm now willing to also mention the Patriots in that, even though they historically have not been a spend heavy on running back type of franchise. The idea that a team is going to say, we have the extra cap space, we're willing to give you 13 million, 13.5 million. I'm not going to take that off the table. You can't do it. You cannot preclude a 3-year, $40 million deal from being a possibility here. And if you get 1, 2, or even a third team that specifically are sniffing around Saquon Barkley, that's all it takes. Now, do organizations and GMs have, dirty handshake agreements about we're not going to spend more than this on a given position? Sure. But any little sense of a bidding war could certainly drive that price point up, at least marginally. And we won't know until we get a first contract here relative to where the projections are. Somebody has to set the baseline, and that's going to be fascinating to watch. Remember, Josh Jacobs was on the call with Saquon Barkley going back 2 offseasons, where they said, we're going to put our foot in the ground. We're going to demand that this position get paid. We need to stick to our guns. It's hard to do it. It's hard to do it when you have talent coming out of the draft, when there's always a guy in the free agent market, when the decline of the position seems so predominantly against everyone inside of that role. It's really hard to put your foot in the ground when the entire league is collectively saying, okay, if not you, somebody else. And the big problem is, whether it's the draft or free agency, there's always a lower tier guy that's going, listen, I want to support the running back room, but this is my chance, right? If I get it out of the draft, I'm trying to perform at a high level for the first couple of years and get my one big payday. So there is that kind of dog eat dog mentality where you want to be collective with one another, and you also understand what's on the line for you. So we turn our attention now then over to the NFL draft, and we'll bring up Draft Buzz, which is just a resource that I like to use. There's obviously dozens of different outlets you can go to. I just happen to like the layout. I happen to like the way that they provide you that average draft position of a lot of these players. And I'm going to roll through it, actually including every prospect that's on the board here, just so we have a clear sense of players going around them at other positions as we work our way through the running back room. And as we do that, feel free, as I always say, get in on the comments here. If you're watching us live on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast feed as well. If you can't get us up visually, don't drive on YouTube. Just throw us on that old podcast feed. We remind you, though, that today's episode is brought to you by Personam. Personam is an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats cyber threats that other tools and platforms just can't do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. You can check out Personam today. So let's think about this overall draft class, which coming out of the combine, my God, the wide receiver room, even some of the quarterbacks are pushing up the board here, offensive linemen. There's a lot here, right? Offensive line, which we'll talk about on Wednesday's show tomorrow, just how they performed at the combine, how they elevated their stock, and it seems like there's a lot of athletes there. The good news is, by and large, just as a side note, the combine seemed to bring almost all positives. Now, there were some injuries, some guys went down, and you always hate to see that. But overall, I thought it was a lot of kind of stock coming up across the board. When you're working this thing live, sometimes you just need that little bit of a palate cleanser there. So as we work our way through, though, we get all the way through. Working all the way through the first round. There's some speculation that there are first running back off the board could still go in the first here. Coming out of the combine, I remember listening. I'm trying to remember. There was a potential for who's going to be one, who's going to be two. Brooks out of Texas is going to be the first one that gets mentioned here. Draft Buzz. Now, here you go. Ready? Overall draft value based on every other prospect in the draft, 44th. Average draft position, 63.8, right? So 64, falling just out of the second round, even though he's a mid to upper echelon of the second round talent. And by the way, the next time that you talk about a running back is going to come as we scroll our way through. I'm already moving into the 60s now, where Brooks is maybe projected to get ultimately drafted, even though his value was 15, 20 picks ahead. We're working our way well down the list here before we're going to run into our next running back. And that becomes an interesting component to this. On the one hand, you'd say, so it isn't a deep running back class necessarily. Now that the position has been devalued, you get to Corum, 86th overall. His average draft rank, though, interestingly enough, is 68.7. So is that just the sweet spot? Getting into this, getting towards that third round, after the first two rounds, you've addressed your number one need in the first. You've looked at your board. You said, hey, we can go a little bit best player available here if we need to. We have at least two or three other needs. Now, round three, if we feel good about what we've addressed, can we go ahead and tap into that? For the Giants, as we know, well, you have two second round picks. Now, will it be too rich for you to go running back that high? I tend to think so. Like if it's me, I'm going to have a hard time going that direction. I ran a mock where the Giants ended up, I think, getting they got Jalen Wright. Jalen Wright was actually, and I think I missed Jalen Wright here when I was working through this running back room. Jalen Wright, just to clarify, he falls into the category draft projected third round, 79th overall. So he's ahead of Corum. And his average draft position, I want to see if I get this here. His average draft position, though, was 93. So even though he's ranked higher on the board overall than Corum, he falls significantly lower. So I ended up getting him in a mock at 108 for the Giants. That felt like a great value. Athlete, needs to refine some aspects of his game, but you really like it. But that's what we're talking about here. And if I think about some of the guys that came through the combine, you mentioned Brooks, mentioned Wright, mentioned Corum, who I think looks solid, right? He is a heavy pound, only 5'8", but 205, going to bounce off some tackles for you. Ran a 4.53. Why do I like Jalen Wright? Because he ran a 4.38. Gives you a little bit of that both and, even though he's slighter of frame as he stands there at 210 pounds, but also at 5'10". So some of these guys matter here. Didn't get too deep, although I did think Laub, although I don't want to pronounce his name wrong, out of UNH, I thought that he had a very nice combine. And he's 156. Like we're getting in the weeds now with some of these players. The reason why we go through these, the reason why we discuss them, as we bring in just Smith here, who comes in with the running backs are devalued until it's time to run out the clock. Yeah. By the way, so good reminder here. So the reason why I bring some of these later round guys is, well, if Saquon's back, you still might be thinking about the future, right? And wanting to bring in a back to prove that you have, to know that you have the next phase of it. Could Eric Gray be that guy? Sure. Nothing jumped out at you a year ago, but the offensive line plays bad and he's a rookie. But you do want to have the contingency plan in place. What if the Giants sign Saquon Barkley to a 3-year contract after he goes to market? And then he comes back in and the Giants have a difficult season and they're sitting there at 2-4, or they're sitting there at 1-5. All of a sudden you're right back at that trade table again. And at that point, I think you would explore it maybe more than you did in years past, because now you're saying, well, this first year has been devalued for us. Where are we going to be another year later? Probably something for a little bit later on down the line. Jackson comes in here with the Giants must re-sign Saquon Barkley. I can debate that. I don't think there's any to be definitive around anything to say that they absolutely have to re-sign him or 100% cannot re-sign him. I think that's a mistake, right? There's always value points where it makes sense to keep him and bring him back. And there's obviously price points and other things that you want to accomplish in the offseason that preclude you from being in on it. Why I bring up these different tiers when we talk about those running backs and talk about second round pick, I think unlikely, but third round pick, depending on when the run starts to happen, right? If I can get Jalen Wright at 90, at 108, I can feel comfortable doing that, assuming the 3 picks prior or 4 picks prior addressed other areas of key need. And we are going to do a mock draft live. I ran one. I reference it when we discuss the QBs in our episode that's either going to air tonight or tomorrow morning. You'll see it come up on your timelines if you're following us and subscribed over on YouTube. I ran through a mock that was just, beautiful thing in terms of the top of the draft. But more importantly, it was as you worked your way through, was able to get a linebacker, able to get an offensive lineman, able to get a running back, able to get a receiver. So you got to walk through those things, and it was really fun. And if you want to be a part of that, I do want to run this in 2 ways. Typically, I've done them. If you follow the show in years past, I've run the mock drafts and just kind of walked through the scenarios and talked about my thinking and addressing all the key areas of need. I'd also love to be able to run a live and put up the poll. We are sitting here at 6. Do we want to stay? Do we want to trade back? Which player do we want to go with? And kind of take the collective. Where does the fan base say we should go? And see how Giants faithful constructs a draft for the New York Football Giants. So be tuned in for those. Those will be live feeds. Usually do them late night, sometimes over the weekends. So you'll see those pop up in the feed as well. But this is all relative. If the Giants don't re-sign Barkley, then it heightens the value of the draft class. It heightens where they maybe want to go there. If they don't bring in a free agent, whoever that may be, then it heightens it, right? Andy's mentioned Singletary as a guy he likes. I've mentioned Antonio Gibson. If you bring in nobody and you don't keep Saquon, then you're going to elevate that. And you're going to start to look at one of these running backs and say, well, if Brooks is the clear-cut best in the class and I come up there, my second pick in the second round, is that, in the 40s? Is that too much? It might be, but maybe there's a small trade down, get a little extra draft capital, draft a little bit higher than you expect to, but get yourself a running back that you believe can come in and be a day one impact player. Incidentally, 21 years old yet is Jonathan Brooks. That to me is a big factor at the running back position. Jalen Wright, who I mentioned, I have to check on his. Actually, they don't list his age. Sometimes concerning when it comes to running backs. I'll try to track that down. Corum there as well. We're talking about him being 23 years old already. So, wear, tread, all those things matter here. We talked about it with the quarterbacks and, Jaden Daniels being 23, 24 years old, only having a player like JJ McCarthy who's 21 years old. That matters here, right? Of course, Antonio Gibson's a good choice. Adam, me. So I like him. And again, price point matters here. But I just think that you can get a dynamic pass catching running back and start to create something that the Giants haven't done and probably should have done more of, creating complementary football in their backfield. It's hard. When you have one of the elite talents, you're not going to necessarily listen. They brought in Matt Breida, as we said, but there was no real intention there, right? They've had other players in that backfield, but they've never risen up to the point where you said, okay, these guys are real rotational contributors to this team. Hasn't happened. Saquon Barkley's healthy. That's the type of team that we are. Saquon Barkley's hurt. We kind of don't know what we are. And you always want to have the best players you can possibly have on your roster. That's point stop. But you do have to think about the totality of balance and what that's going to look like. If you're referring to drafting Marvin Harrison Jr., I don't see him being there at 6 overall, Jackson. That seems, although, there has been talks. How much is Dunze brought his stock up over the combine? Where is Neighbors inside of that room as well? Like there are those discussions, but I don't think that you're sitting there at 6 and getting Marvin Harrison Jr. for the New York Football Giants. And while you could do it, playmakers abound, and you'll have any wide receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr. or otherwise, for multiple seasons. But you're still talking about the QB position, right? How are you going to address that? We talk about that on our next regularly scheduled episode, so be sure to check that out. Right back to the top, in case you're just joining us. New York Football Giants not putting the tag on Saquon Barkley. He is expected to get to free agency. The new league year does not start until the 13th. Things could still change between now and then. But as it stands, it looks like Joe Schoen is going to allow the market to dictate his value and allow Saquon Barkley to maybe make a decision. If the dollars are all close, is it true that you just want to come back to this team, that you feel comfortable just saying, hey, I did want to retire a Giant. I still do. The money is right there. They're not going to be able to totally match whatever the case may be, or come close to matching whatever the number is. I'm just going back to Big Blue. I don't want to uproot my family. I don't want to have to move, right? So it could be true. And you saw Dan Duggan, actually, as somebody had mentioned, couldn't they still sign him before the start of the new league year, which is true. They still have that window. Duggan, I think, kind of says they've been negotiating for 16 months with Saquon Barkley. That cannot be overlooked in all of this conversation. It's not like this is a year ago. It's not like this is a 1-year free agent that you brought it on the cheap and now you're trying to decide what are we going to do with them and you want to find the right price point. But hey, something's hard. The market's going to be there. This is you know this player and this player knows you. Now he did change agency, so he did does have new representatives, and the Giants do have connections and experience with him, and so that's worth noting. But he's going to free agency, right? Like they're still going to go test this market. The numbers are the numbers, and they've only gotten worse for Saquon Barkley, and they've only validated further Joe Schoen and the Giants. And if we take Joe Schoen, as we talk about the QBs and what he mentioned about Daniel Jones tomorrow, he said about Saquon Barkley, we obviously appreciate who he is, appreciate who he is in the locker room, appreciate the talent that he is, captain. Like things have changed for the better for Saquon over this past season. And also, it's the market, it's the position, it's the value, and it's the needs of the team. Joe Schoen, we said at times, has been to his own detriment, maybe a little bit too transparent, because I think he publicly does want to set the right narrative around this is why it's not just if we like Saquon or not just what his talent is. It's also about all these other factors. And I think that's the reality for GMs in the NFL. And he mentions it all the time. It's about thinking 2 and 3 and 4 years down the line. It's about thinking about the other positions we need to address. It's about thinking about the value in the draft class. If you believe that one of these running backs that we talked about before, let's just, even those top 2, Brooks, Wright, Corum, even somebody further, if you think one of those running backs is going to give you 65% of Saquon Barkley in year number 1, and the price point is X because you're drafting him in the mid rounds, you're going to evaluate that. Is Antonio Gibson at $3.6 million combined with player X from the draft going to equal somewhat similar value to what Saquon on an individual level brings? I think so. And it also comes tied to fixing the offensive line, making sure that that's stabilized. And that can benefit Saquon if he returns. It can benefit rookies. It can benefit free agents. So all these things play a part in it. That being the case, we also obviously highlighted Xavier McKinney. There's some talk about putting the transition tag on because it's going to come in closer to $13 million than the regular franchise tag, which would be at $17 million. Will he play on that? That would be wait and see. I think it extends their timeline to negotiate. He's 24 years old. He's been very valuable. New defensive coordinator. You want to keep some stability in there. Right up the gut. Xavier McKinney, Bobby Okereke, Dexter Lawrence, right? Let's make that value for this defensive unit as we work forward. I think it's far more likely that he gets the contract extension over a 4-year deal, something as we've heard it reported, 12 to 14, even if it's on the higher side of 14. So be it. I can live with that number. And I think having him here till he's 27, 28 years old is going to be a big value for this team. Last one we'll mention here, Smith comes in to Texas. Yeah, I think we highlighted this on an episode. I mentioned this earlier today on the live. Houston has the draft capital. By the way, people have even said, I should make this fully clear. I mentioned about, Saquon Barkley, the Houston Texans, um, and him going there. There's even been the speculation that a team like Dallas will try to sort itself out and be able to make a run, and that the Giants have to at least think about keeping Saquon Barkley because it would be in their best interest to not only retain a quality player for themselves, but also prevent them from going elsewhere. The problem is you've got the Dallas Cowboys have to figure a lot of money stuff out before they can make any type of moves like that. They also said, hey, why not in division with the Philadelphia Eagles? That's a little different. They have $37.8 million current. Oh, sorry, cap space they have. So they do the cap and then effective cap. 41.9 effective cap is $37.8 million. So yeah, like they have the ability to go and possibly make a run at him. Would it sting to have him leave and go in division? Of course it would. Like, no doubt about it. But should him potentially signing, let's say, with the Eagles, be the reason that Joe Schoen says, nuts to it, 13 million a year, let's go? No, right? You can't afford to do that. You cannot afford to make a decision as a reaction to what another team may want to do. That's usually where, what do we say? And it feels less likely with Saquon, where you'd say, well, like, who knows the player best than the team that he's been playing for the entirety of his career to this point. I think he's going to be successful wherever he goes if he leaves New York. But you can't say, well, because Philly was going to sign him, we have to see him twice a year, then we'll keep him. Sorry, you're going to have to take those lumps and live with the fact that when you see him twice a year, if he goes in division, it's going to be rough. And he'll probably break off a big run, and the celebration will be there, and you'll have to tip your hat and deal with seeing a star on the side of the helmet, deal with seeing the wings on the side of the helmet. Less likely you see a W on the side of the helmet, but that'd be the nature of it. Back to just Smith here, who said to the Texans, that matters. Where you go matters, right? We talk about Miami when Tyreek Hill ended up there and having less tax concerns there. You talk about it with Texas, the value of the contract increases. So dollar for dollar, the Texans not only say, we will give you $12 million AAV a year, it also marginally increases by what you save in the taxing. So yeah, 12 million versus the Giants 10 million. And it really feels like 13 million versus 9 million, right? So that gap does widen. If it's about a payday, as Saquon Barkley should have every right to have it be about, then going to Houston is going to be an answer for you, right? And they may be the suitor that is most likely to pay you. So I think at the end of the day, what we end up talking about with Saquon is this going to be about his personal desire, which might be to stay in New York, to keep his family where it's been since he was drafted, to stay with one franchise, to be a legacy player like Eli Manning, right? Like Michael Strahan, like Tiki Barber, even though his relationship got a little muddled initially upon his exit, then yeah, right. Then maybe you want, then maybe that factors into the tune of $1 or $2 million difference on a contract. But if this is the last payday and you don't know what your post-playing career holds, maybe it holds things in Brock. If you want to do it, maybe he doesn't want to do that, right? I mean, Saquon, Michael Strahan wanted to do that. Does that mean that Saquon Barkley is dying to get into that? We'll find out. So it still comes down to the payday and a chance to win, by the way. Saquon Barkley has not had a chance to play competitive high-level playoff football all but once, being with the Giants here, right? So from that standpoint, going to a team that is ascending right now, like the Houston Texans, that can win their division this upcoming year, that can be a high-level competitive playoff football team, that can be very attractive on a different way, right? I think sometimes we get a little bit bogged down in saying, well, post-playing career and not wanting to move and it wants to be a Giant. That's all great. You think these guys don't all want to win? Saquon Barkley has not had a chance to play winning football with the New York Football Giants for the majority of his career. Going and playing winning football is also incredibly enticing for players as they work their way towards the back end of their career. Even though Saquon has years still ahead of him, we know it's shorter, certainly by running back standards. Last one here we'll throw up. Only 4 running backs you could replace Saquon with: Singletary, Swift, Pollard, or Patterson. Everyone else would be a significant and severe downgrade. I mean, they would be downgrades, yes. I agree on Singletary. I think Swift is very enticing. I don't agree on Pollard, maybe with where his price point's going to be. I did mention Patterson previously. We did talk about him when it came to free agents on the market and where the Giants could go. Now, he's on the older side, but because he's a versatile running back, because he's a former wide receiver, you can certainly look at him and say, well, we can manufacture some bonus value out of this one player. And if I look over on the NFL free agent market here and just talk about where his was, because I think they had a projection on what his contract would look like. And it was low. I think it's something around the $3 million range as well. So it's right in the wheelhouse of where you want to be. But I would disagree, not vehemently. I would somewhat strongly disagree on Tony Pollard being one of the guys that you have to, that you could only replace him with. I think Singletary makes a lot of sense. And if I could find Cordell Patterson somewhere on this list, I certainly will mention where his market value is, assuming that they provide it. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, by the way, he's sub 25 years old. He lost his starting job to a 7th-round rookie. Only $1.6 million for him on a 1-year prove-it deal. Why not take a shot on him? There's Cordell Patterson. Now, Cordell, $2.5 million, 1-year deal. And he's coming in on the older side, as we say, right? So there's a difference there too. Cordell Patterson's 33 years old. I don't touch it for a number of reasons, even the 2.5 million, which is very friendly, but I probably stay away from Cordell Patterson in the end. I go with somebody a little bit younger. If I was looking at Cordell Patterson, then I'm looking at Antonio Gibson, and I would push back on the idea that Patterson is somehow one of those 4 guys. Now, I love his play style. I love the value that he brings. But I think again, my belief is you can replace Saquon Barkley in any number of ways. It's never going to be 1-to-1, but the combination of improving offensive line play, adding a free agent, going to the draft, the totality of what your team is, how your team gets better as a whole, that's how you replace Saquon Barkley. You don't go in and say, we'll sign Tony Pollard and we'll replace Saquon Barkley. It's just not going to be true. Some guys are going to be better at filling that role than others, but I don't believe you do any 1-to-1 kind of number crunching. And that's really when we come back to this contract, what I think Joe Schoen is doing. Where would I spend $10 to $12 million if not on Saquon Barkley? And how do I feel this organization and this team will be improved in 2024 if I do so? That being the case, I can feel my voice getting hoarse, if I'm being totally honest here. I'm going to go ahead and tie a bow on this one. No expectation for the New York Football Giants to tag Saquon Barkley. He will go to free agency. And now the wait and see is going to be, what are the speculations about teams that are going to be interested, who potentially is going to be a suitor for Saquon, and where do those numbers start to fall, right? As soon as we get a little bit of a taste about where those numbers are, then we can start to have a real conversation about what the Giants would need to bring him back in, whether or not we think that's likely, and then starting to explore how these markets develop for other players. I will say, just as a final footnote, when we have these conversations, I've said I think the Giants should move on from Saquon Barkley. Now that's evolved. I said they should have done it ahead of last year in the summer. I said they should have done it at the trade deadline over this past season as well. Like, I've been an advocate for that, which has nothing to do with Saquon Barkley as an individual, nothing to do with him as an on-football talent, and everything to do with where this franchise is and where they should be allocating money and what they need to do to build themselves successfully going forward. So make no mistake about it. Keeping Saquon Barkley is a great idea, but this team is just in a different place than being high level competitive, competing for divisions, competing for playoff victories. And all those things need to play big factors in this. We'll be back again. Like I said, tomorrow morning, you'll hear a conversation where I refer to it as Tuesday because we recorded it today. But with this type of discussion, we want to spread things out. So we'll talk about the QBs. We'll talk about Russ Wilson getting designated to be released by the Denver Broncos. Andy will make a case for why he thinks the Giants should be in those discussions for him and what that would look like. Also, where J.J. McCarthy stands in the draft hierarchy. Has Penix pushed his way into top 10? And Daniel Jones, and this narrative coming out that, hey, the New York Football Giants are done with him, whether it's in the short or long term. All those things will be coming down the pike. So what you can do for us is, if you're on YouTube right now, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, right? Turn on the alerts so you know when we're going live with our normal episodes and our bonus draft coverage and our mock drafts. You can also get us on your podcast feeds. Go over to onegiantpodcast.com. We'll be seeing links up there as I'm putting out some articles. Had a few out from the combine. Going to update things around potential targets to replace Saquon Barkley in free agency. Go into more detail on some of the guys I talked about and where I think their value lies inside of the Giants and Mike Kafka's system. So you can see that coming up there as well. You can get me on Substack at Adam Armbrecht if you want to find me there too. And we'll have some other content going up on the website. So help support that there. Links to all of our latest episodes. We'll be doing stuff like that along the way too. Over on Twitter at Adam Armbrecht, at AndyMac214, and at One Giant Podcast. Greatly appreciate supporting the show, supporting what we're trying to build and accomplish here. And that happens by going and checking out sponsors, whether it's Personam today, whether it's Potential, whether it's going and looking at Manscaped and using the exclusive promo code OGP24. If you're in the market for any of that type of product, get free shipping, get 20% off your order, right? Those things help move the needle and help us continue to grow and expand our brand. I appreciate every single person that not only joined in over the course of this live, but Cy Guy Bry, frequent flyer, Sadon Smith. You seem like a fairly new face, but if you've been here before, I'm sorry. Timothy Firth, you've been here many of times, or Frith, excuse me. Seen you many times in the comments as well. And also Baxatalk, you too, man. And Jackson Black too. Everybody that came in and got into the conversation. Thank you. That's what we usually with these lives, we want them to be, is opportunities to interact with the fan base, hear from you guys, and have these discussions in a way that feels like we're talking about not only how we view it, but also how you and how the Giants fan base perceives the way the Giants should move things going forward. We'll be back again tomorrow talking all things New York Football Giants. And as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know, as always, let's go Big Blue.